We really want to hear what you think. I think we're going to get some chairs brought up here now so that our first three speakers can take to the stage and listen and respond to what they hear you saying. But while the chairs are moved, perhaps I can read one thing. I took a screenshot of today's Scotsman, and buried on an inside page, right down, it was a left-hand page, bottom right-hand corner, so tucked away, is a piece entitled Healthy Life Expectancy Gap. This is today. The difference in healthy life expectancy levels for Scots living in the richest and the poorest parts of the country is more than 20 years, official figures have revealed. It's growing. So despite everything we've heard over the past 20 years, our gap is getting worse. So the challenge is over to you. We've got about 30 minutes to solve it. Well, would you want to come up onto the stage up here then? I'm going to come down with a microphone and get in a booty, if that isn't too scary a prospect. If you wanted to contribute to this discussion, would you put your hand up? I don't know where have I got a microphone down at the front here? Can I take one of your mics from the back? Thank you. Is there something obvious that you think's been missed? I'm going to come to you. Keep that hand up there, and then great, we've got another couple. Because honestly, if you don't pick it up, I can carry on for hours. Let me bring you this. Would you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name's Heather Ford. I'm the chair of the West Cromwell Street Perseverance Citadel Residents Association.
Cool.
What I would like to ask is, would Scotland adopt the approach that Canada has to a national housing strategy? Which is what?
In a nutshell, tell us what that is.
It's using a human rights-based approach.
And it's working, is it? Yeah. Great. But I'm going to come back to that, if that's okay with you. There were more hands going up here, weren't there? Let me bring you, I think, so you had your hand up first, did you? And then let me pass it around. Is that okay? I'm going to try and be fair here, because it's a human right. Thank you.
Hi, Dominic Brooks, live in the Scottish Borders, director on the Scottish Borders Social Enterprise Chamber. My question is supplying the housing the right way about it to solve homelessness? What about the support to prevent homelessness occurring in the first place, but also to support those that need it so they don't become homeless again?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Two very important questions. I'm going to take a third, okay, which will allow us to hear as many voices as possible.
Hi, I'm Lynn McMath from Crisis, the GB-wide homelessness charity. There's not a word that anybody said that I would disagree with, but what I think is missing from the discussion so far, from upstairs and from down here tonight, is the fact that Scotland's the only country in the UK, and indeed much of Europe now, that actually now has a government ending homelessness strategy and plan. And there's not really been much said about that. And I know obviously Alison, who I've seen somewhere from Shelter, who sat on that as well as we did. So I think, absolutely the challenges are the challenges, but we do actually have a bit of government commitment. And what do we do with that? How do we support that, and how do we make sure that it's actually delivered and goes ahead?
Thank you very much. So 3 good points to start with, but I'd like to ask this audience first. We've heard great praise for the promises that have been made in Scotland about housing. We've put, again, the rhetoric's firmly on the table. How many of you fear that it is just rhetoric, that it's chat, that it'll get overtaken by other things? Do you fear that, or do you think that actually probably that's enough? Do you fear it? Hands up if you fear that it's just chat and that it's got to go further. Well, I think that's quite a significant number who think that it's got to go a bit further. Can I pick that up? I mean, we've heard the warnings about, we can be very complacent and pat ourselves on the back and say we're the best country in the world. Do we need to go further on this particular subject, Val McDermid?
I think we need to hold the politicians to what they've said. and make it clear to them that if they don't carry out what they've promised, then they'll suffer at the ballot box. And that's the only weapon that we have. But we need to be insistent. We need to talk about this, and we need it not to be invisible. And politicians are very good at slipping away from things if we don't keep them at the front of the agenda. So that's what we need to do. We need to keep it at the front of the agenda. We need to keep ramming it down their throats, by the way. You don't get to forget about this.
And before I come to Alan on that question about Canada, Karyn McCluskey, do you trust the politicians to do the right thing without...
Sorry, guys. Right, so politicians, the two things that they do is make laws, spend money. Now, and I know you do a lot more than that. We need to give them better advice. I mean, you know, and I do think they're committed. I did actually mention, I think there's a paradigm shift happening. There's some green shoots starting, but it needs to go a lot faster, doesn't it? You know, I quite like speed and pace, but we need to give the politicians clear, unambiguous advice about the direction of travel. There are two, and this is a challenge, there are lots and lots of voices in the homelessness sector. Sometimes you give conflicting advice. That's really hard for politicians. So there's a wee bit of work that we all need to do about trying to get what is it we agree on about the direction of travel. And then we need to say it to the politicians, because we can't challenge them, you know, unless we're clear.
Thank you. Alan, you obviously think that a law is necessary, because although we might have receptive ears right now, I mean, given the political situation right across the UK, we don't know what's going to happen next. Yeah, do you think it's that important?
Yeah, you have to have a guarantee of rights. It can't just be left to promises and declarations. Let me just pick up the rhetoric thing. I was quite struck that actually, unusually, it was a minority who were sort of saying that rhetoric, is dangerous.
Quite a significant minority.
Yeah,
we might be talking 48.
But if I could just...
I don't think it was as many
take
as
that on.
I can't count.
Because a lot of the work that I now do with the UN in many parts of the world makes me conclude that when you talk about rhetoric, there is good rhetoric and there is bad rhetoric. And there's a lot of bad rhetoric taking place in our country and around the world. So those who do good rhetoric should be supported in doing that. If you speak up for the rights of immigrants, of refugees, of asylum seekers, or the homeless, if that's all you do, that's still a positive contribution in today's country and world. Obviously, it's not enough. You then have to go on to translate the rhetoric into action. And picking up Heather's question about can we learn from Canada and a housing strategy, and also the question from Crisis, I think that's right. Scotland is developing in a piecemeal way and a sort of instinctive way a human rights-based approach to housing. It has to be made into a big coherent framework with laws and guarantees and processing. But let me give you an example on homelessness. Just to have the right to a home, which is enshrined in the Scottish law. If you compare that to Ireland, which thought about should we do that, put a right to a home, and they decided not to. It would still be a sort of needs priority based. And when some work was done to see, well, what was the difference in the outcomes between Scotland and Ireland from these two different approaches? And what they found out was that in Scotland, because it was a right that was put out there, that has had an impact on everybody, not just the homeless, but those making decisions about homelessness. I've thought, wait a minute, this person's got a right. I better pay attention to this. In Ireland, those making daily decisions about housing were still thinking in the old way that they would make the decisions on behalf of this person according to their policies or systems. It wasn't people-centred at all. Now, that's not to say that we've cracked it in Scotland, because again, a shelter report clearly shows when people go and ask to be registered as homeless, there's a gatekeeper system, and not everyone is registered as homeless in the way that they're entitled to be. So we have a way to go, but we've set out on that road, and we can be confident, I think, that more progress can be made.
Thank you. And then there was the question also that came up, which was about, but I'd like to take some more comments from the floor, but we're going to come back to prevention of homelessness. It's not just about saying, okay, here's a house, but we'll come back to that. Hands were going up. I'm being very one-sided here on this side of the room. Yeah, if you want to give the microphone there, and then I'll bring it to you. Thank you.
Robert Murray.
It's working. Keep going.
In 1870,
Okay.
1891, Buffalo Bill came to Scotland, to Glasgow, and he was so appalled by the states of Glasgow slums that he went back to America and wrote in the America Journal how bad Glasgow was as the slums. After the Second World War, the British government, though they were said they were bankrupt, built new housing estates, new homes for people, and from that, they have done nothing.
Oh.
Singapore, before the 50th birthday came up, Singapore, I read a report that they pulled down all the slums in Singapore, built new homes, new flats for everyone. And Singapore is, as we all know, one of the richest countries after Britain.
So what do you think we should be doing here then?
Why can't we do the same?
Yeah, thank you so much. We're going to come back to that. Let me put the microphone down here. Thank you.
Right. Hello, my name's Claire Simpson. I'm from Parenting Across Scotland. Val and Karyn talked about how we see homeless people so often that we become inured to it and we become almost immune. And something happened to me the other day that really shocked me, and it's like the other side of the coin. Somebody turned up at my doorstep, turned up to be a woman who owned the flat 3 above from me. I live in a tenement. This bit isn't shocking. There was a leak, fairly common for tenements. She said, I want to get in touch with the woman downstairs. Can I get a phone number? Fine. And she said to me, you see, I own the flat upstairs. And then she said, I don't live there.
Yeah.
I keep my dogs there. And I kind of was dumbstruck. I didn't even know how to question her. But I suppose my question is to you, going back to prevention and going back to sort of radical intervention, how do we tackle the level of inequality that allows someone to own 2 houses, keep their dogs in them, and someone else to live on the streets?
Thank you. Good question. Thank you very much. So I think that point there ties up with this this massive gap between rich and poor that is growing. We seem to think that in Scotland everybody thinks the right way about poverty and homelessness, but we don't necessarily, do we? How do we, those people who are in the other group, which appears to be growing, the group of privilege, how do we make this relevant to them? I don't know whether, does anybody particularly want to take that one on? Because, I think, Val, it was you that said, people think it's must got nothing to do with me, Well,
Danny Dorling, who I mentioned earlier when I was speaking, has written a book last year called Peak Inequality, where he essentially is putting forward the thesis that we cannot afford the 1%. We have to reorganise our fiscal arrangements so that the very, very, very rich can't avoid paying for the society that they live in. And we have I think, a pretty large number of empty houses that aren't even lived in as holiday homes, aren't even lived in as weekend cottages. And that's something that needs to be addressed. If you've got an empty house, then I think you should pay 5 times the council tax on it. If you're not using that property, if it's sitting empty when people need housing, then you should pay for it.
And Karyn, if you have a flat for your dogs,
and I tell you something, Jacob Rees-Mogg's father, William Rees-Mogg, published a book in around about the time of the millennium, the last chapter of which posits the end of the nation state, that the world will be run by the super rich, who will have their enclaves, where they will have their staff and their people, and they will have walls, and the people beyond that, they're basically, excuse me, fucked.
Yeah. It feels scarily like that's happening. How
we need to tackle that.
How do we put the brakes on that, if that is what's happening now? And it does feel like that to me. You know, it feels like we've got kind of like middle-class enclaves that are almost like gated communities developing in our various communities around Scotland. Or am I being particularly cynical, Alan?
No, I mean, there's increasing inequalities. I mean, if you, I don't know, many of you are in Glasgow, familiar with Glasgow, but you go from Bearsden to Shettleston, and you lose 2 years life expectancy on each of
to
the
Drumchapel, you have to step across the road.
five stops across the breadth of Glasgow. A human rights-based approach and what the recommendations are to the First Minister and all of that. What would it do to prevent homelessness? Well, clearly one of the things it would do would be to very clearly target reducing this inequality by prioritising those most marginalised, vulnerable and the poorest in Scotland. So in terms of budgetary decision making, policies, where resources are allocated towards, priority would go to those who are disempowered, the poorest, etc. And you would progressively realise and reduce the inequality that exists.
But this, I come back to rhetoric, and it's ineffective rhetoric. We've been talking about this for decades, Karyn McCluskey. Why aren't we seeing any benefit from it? Has it happened in your experience?
Give her the easy questions.
Oh, give me the easy question.
Well, I mean, there's you working, police with violence reduction, community justice. Are you getting any sense that all the chat over the last 20 years, which has been about recognising the inequity of the gap, has actually been followed by any action?
Nope.
Thank you.
So,
that's the kind of answers we want.
I should just leave it there, really, shouldn't I? But we have otherisation. It's probably the biggest problem we have, So people are closing their curtains in Kensington and Chelsea and in Bearsden and Morningside and just think that's these other people. Yeah. It's not part of us. Yeah. And that is a real challenge. But can I tell you, here's a bit that I am actually really hopeful. Yeah. Loads of you, I'll have bored loads of you over the years with David's story. And I used to ask everybody, I was about a young murderer and they had a boy and I used to say to people, if I told you I could change his outcome, would you pay more tax? Now, I must have spoken to about 300,000 or 400,000 people. And can I tell you, everybody put up their hand. We are still connected. And so I still think it's maybe that top 1% aren't, but the rest of us are. Yeah. So we need to make them more of the outgroup.
Okay. Well, yeah, because and I think one of the ways that we do that is we tax them.
I
would cheerfully pay more tax for a more equal society. And if the people don't want to pay more tax for a more equal society, then they can go away. Exactly. We'll manage without them. We'll build our own society.
Thank you very much. So there's a big idea. I'm going to take another contribution from the floor.
Hi, Michael Carberry. I work for Blacairn Housing Association in Glasgow, north of Glasgow. I'm not going to ask you a question, I'm going to make a suggestion, but before I do, if I could just pick up on Karyn's point about mixed messages. I was at a seminar yesterday, it was about the publication of Housing as a Social Determinant of Health, and it said neighbourhood and local connection is really important. And today I got guidance from the Scottish Housing Regulator that told me I've not to count local connection and neighbourhood in terms of managing need and considering housing applications. Yeah. I've worked in housing in Glasgow since 1974, and everybody will know about the right to buy. It came out in 1980.
Why?
What you probably don't know is that at the same time, people like me got a directive from the government that said, you will house those in greatest housing need. And we said, what do you mean? And they said, well, you work it out. We'll come and regulate you. We'll do an audit. And we said, if you follow that to its logical conclusion, you will create ghettos of poverty. And at the same time, all the academics, Glasgow University, were all saying the same thing. About 2005, Glasgow City Council senior official said at a seminar like this, social housing is for poor people. And that is the problem. I think my suggestion to you is we are obsessed with home ownership in this country. We have to change our culture.
Yes.
And what we have to do is make social housing a legitimate choice of tenure.
Yeah. Fantastic. Excellent. Thank you so much.
Essentially, that means going in a way. That means going back to the future. Because when I was growing up, there was no stigma to live in a council house.
But there
because
is
almost
now.
everybody did.
So we've gone
And there is now.
backwards. There was a gentleman there asked about, why aren't we investing in social housing? You talked about the building, yeah? Oh, aye. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. But can I just pick up this point from this guy, the guy that asked about why aren't we building more? Yeah. It's all right. You're here until 8:30, I hope.
I'll take a stand like
We'll
the
come back
previous
to
speaker.
that
Helps
one.
me think. I don't know about you. I just want to go some more. Sorry, my name's Scott Ressick. I work for an organisation called Energy Action Scotland. And words are very powerful, and I'm sure Val can agree with this. I think the words, and going back to Alan's point about universal well, it wasn't his
Yeah.
point, so obviously it was Roosevelt's point. Home.
Yeah.
It's different from housing. Right?
Community.
We had 2 phases of major housing building driven by policy in the last 100 years.
Yeah.
Between World War I and World War II.
Yeah.
Driven by the 1919 Housing Act. Remember that? 100 years ago? There we go. Right?
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. and sorry, we'll get to the point.
Yeah.
And then in the second, after the Second World War, so late 1950s, 1960s, etc.
Yeah. We
So
don't
2
need the
major
dates.
houses of providing houses. Are they homes?
Oh, were they ever home? Were they homes? Yeah, thank you. Brilliant. What makes a home?
Because we're still trying to fix them.
Yeah, thank you. So in other words, building's not enough. It's community and building in amongst it, yeah? And that perhaps the community bit, we've been in danger of losing with an obsession with units and numbers of houses. Is that, Val, you said in your living memory growing up, it wasn't stigmatizing to live in social housing. We have cities in Europe where social housing is the norm. People have lifelong tenures in cities like Berlin and things. Is this part of our kind of money-driven, greed-driven world that we've now reached a stage where we're talking about the poor and the disenfranchised in social housing only?
Well, it's the sort of thing. Basically, what happened when Margaret Thatcher said we could all buy our council houses, and that completely decimated, more than decimated, the council housing stock, and that changed the culture. Now, it's very easy to change a culture, but it's really hard to reverse that change, to go back to where you were before, to make things different. When the change is about making people feel empowered, even though it's false. And that's when the culture changed in this country. From certainly in Scotland, where I think in England it was different in England, but in Scotland when I was growing up, certainly there was no shame in living in a council house.
Absolutely not.
And a lot of council housing was actually quite good.
Yeah.
I mean, the council housing stock, a lot of it was good. It was good housing.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Alan, you want to come in there?
Yeah, I mean, one of the benefits of putting into our law and our everyday practice the right to adequate housing is that adequate has been defined what that means in a number of different respects. One of them is that the housing made affordable and accessible and available to people is rooted in a community. So that's very, very clear as what adequate actually means. It's a home and not just a house. And what I think putting this into law and sort of normalising that approach is it brings out the best of what Scotland has tried to do, but not in a consistent way. For example, the man at the back there was talking about Buffalo Bill coming to Glasgow. And I don't know, you must have watched that programme about the longest streets in the UK, and Duke Street in Glasgow. And it actually did show, a Buffalo Bill coming to Glasgow. But that's an example where the residents of Duke Street, who are going to be rehoused out to the new housing estates, the deserts with Windies, as Billy Connolly has referred, with no community, with no facilities at all for everyday sort of community life, resisted that and established the first housing association in the UK. And now you can see the benefit of that approach. Putting it into law and everyday practice would sort of take these best part of our housing approach and actually make that the normal. That's what's done. And therefore, to answer your question, a home is not a house. A home is rooted in the community.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take another contribution.
John Mason, MSP for Glasgow Shettleston, including Duke Street. Alan is putting a lot of emphasis on putting things into law. I just wonder, is that just a fashion at the moment that we'll get rid of child poverty, put that into law, get rid of NHS waiting list, put that into law, and all of these things. Is it just a fashion? Will it really happen? Will it make a difference?
Thanks. If you wanted to answer that one. I mean, Karyn, do you think that making these things laws will automatically help to solve the problem?
No.
No. There's another one-word answer.
Sorry,
Let's take the
I
contribution
don't.
from...
It needs more than that.
I guess owner of many hats, but for the sake of this question, I'll wear my hat of the UK rep for homelessness for Europe and for Fianza. I've spent a joyous weekend in Helsinki in the freezing temperatures looking to see, sorry to mention the B word, we've avoided it till now.
Well, it's been used once.
But looking to see what's happening with homelessness after Brexit. It's not a happy picture, but in particular what came up with the unhappy picture is human rights. We've really managed to use the EU laws with human rights, and after this we're pretty screwed.
Well, because there's danger of our government not being part of the European Court of Human Rights and actually just quietly dropping them. Right, okay, so I wonder whether, does anybody else, I'm interested in coming back to this idea of housing in communities. I don't know if anybody saw that amazing figure in the week, Persimmon the builder, which has recorded record eye-watering profits, but basically I heard that they make a profit of £66,000 for every house they build, or that was certainly in their last records. When we talk in Scotland about, you know, the 50,000 houses, we talk about nebulous concepts like affordable houses. I don't know if anyone knows what that means, but affordability to one person in the middle of Edinburgh may be very different than affordability elsewhere. Is there not an opportunity with the potentially burning platform that is Brexit about really energising, building our own houses, skilling, using that as a way of skilling up people, teaching, building skills base? That, it strikes me, has the potential to build community, give capacity to folk that maybe, you know, could use it.
It was a thing in the 80s, wasn't it more? People would club together, they'd buy a chunk of land and you know, 10 families, a dozen families would all help each other out and build their houses.
And in Glasgow, there's a little scheme starting to happen with the council freeing up land and inviting people to self-build, for instance, on it. Are we too fixed with the models that we have, do you think? You know, could we, for instance, be going to communities of ex-prisoners and saying, I'll tell you what would you like? You know, where would you like to be? How would you like to build it? What would it look like? You know, really taking it away from the profit merchants, basically, is what I'm asking, and putting it in the hands of the people that need the housing. Is there potentially an advantage in that? I don't know, Alan.
Someone wants to answer, I think.
I can't see a hand. Thank you. The lights are bright, so I
Hi, my name is Lee. I'm a volunteer with Shelter Scotland. Just one of the things for me, I'm a single mum with 4 kids, and to carry on with my studies, my council's response and local housing response to being able to carry on with my studies was that you and your 4 children will have to go homeless if you want a house. How do you propose on changing that if that's the attitude you get from local authority?
Thank you very much. So in order to get a house, you have to actually be declared homeless and therefore be...
That's what the council's response is. How do you...
That's the council's response. Let me come back to that in a moment after we take another contribution, and I'm going up the back. Yeah. Thank you.
My name is Sarah and I work for the Scottish Federation of Housing Association. So I want to pick up Michael's point that we do have good models out there, cooperatives and housing associations which are not for profit, which reinvest in communities, involve tenants, and the quality of those properties now is fantastic. They're really good homes, and it is that thing that we're rationing them because there's not enough. And there's lots of young people or people low incomes who'd like them. So it goes back to the point, we need to build more homes, but we also need support, whether it's from the health service, from local authorities, because there's an inequality as well. So it's not just the building, but I like your idea of using the building process to create apprentices, to create jobs in local communities. And the thing about putting money in affordable housing, it does actually happen.
Yeah.
We would have liked 60,000 houses, but we're getting 50,000.
Yeah.
The issue is what happens in a couple of years. We need to keep that money going so that we get those new homes, quality homes, safe
Absolutely.
homes, accessible
And
homes.
of those 50,000 houses, 35,000 are for social rent specifically.
Social rent. So they're affordable and accessible to people. If we sorted out universal credit, that would help as well.
Yeah.
I'd add that
Thank
on.
you. I'm not going to forget your point. I'm going to come back to that, all right? But I'm going to go up here and hand the microphone over to somebody that's waited again. Sorry.
Thanks very much. It actually sort of follows on, because one of the things that gives me great optimism, I'm sorry, my name's Faye, I work with Turning Point Scotland, we're a service provider. One of the things that gives me some optimism at this stage is that the growing value, the growing place of the voices of people who are living this, the people who are best placed to tell us where the system doesn't work and what could work in its place. And that's where I think we get those innovative and exciting and creative ideas that take us away from these silos that we so often work in. And I think by placing greater value on stories like the Mum of Four, who was speaking just now, we place value on those. Those stories are visible, they're present, they're valued. That attacks on the stigma and the otherizing that we need to get past as well to get this general buy-in. I'd like to see a lot more of that. I'd like to see some work to tackle the stigma, but I also think we need to think about, not necessarily about more stuff, more instructions, more structures. We've got a lot of good stuff there. Can we pay attention to these hundreds of little examples of where it doesn't work, and how do we tackle those?
Yeah. Val McDermid, one way of bringing these issues right up to people that have never experienced anything like the vulnerability that so many people are living with is to tell stories about them.
Yeah.
To share their experiences.
It's true, and all sorts of stories find their way into people's fiction, and it's a very powerful way of communicating. But the other side of that, from my point of view as a creator, is the story has to be part of the story I need to tell. You can't start out with a mission. I can't sit down and say, this is going to be my homelessness thriller, because then I'll write a really bad book, because then it's all about the message and not about the story. So first and foremost, for something to have power, it has to have part of the story. But for example, I wrote a couple of novels ago, I involved the story of Syrian refugees coming to this country, and used that within the framework of the novel. It was part of the story, it was part of the plot. And the response I've had to that has been quite extraordinary. I didn't do it in a preachy, I didn't do it to be preachy. I just did it because it made sense in terms of the story I wanted to tell. And that's the most powerful way you can to draw on your experiences. Some writers write very directly about these kind of issues.
And for individuals to share their stories without fear of stigma. There's nothing wrong with standing up and saying, I'm a single mother, and look at what my council's just said to me, which leads me to another question. Why don't we have, we're a small country. We're 5 million people. We've got 32 local authorities. They're all doing things differently, potentially. There's some of them giving advice like that. There's others doing the right thing. Alan, would your law mean that everybody had to do the same thing and there wasn't a postcode lottery about this?
Generally, yeah. I mean, you have to meet local needs and context. Rural areas are different from urban areas, obviously, but it would be a national framework. Can I just pick up a couple of points very, very quickly? John, sort of direct challenge to me, is it a fashionable thing to say, put it into law and that's the end of it? Law is part of the solution. It's not the solution in and of itself. But without the law, there's no power shift takes place between the disempowered person and the decision maker. They need to have the law on their side if they're going to shift that power imbalance. But the law then has to put into practice. And on the storytelling, we're taking small steps in Scotland, but I think it gives us confidence of what we can do if we scale it up. The social security system, like a lot of talk about universal credit, when Scotland got some of the powers devolved and is now establishing its new social security system, there were 2,000 users of the old DWP social security system asked to share their stories, their experience of what was wrong with that system and lessons to be learned before we started a new system. And that's the sort of thing that gives you encouragement that will get better outcomes.
And who's listening? We've hit time. We've reached the end of this session. It's unbelievable, isn't it? It feels like it ought to be just starting. There's so much to cover. We haven't touched on health and social care and, you know, silos and joint funding and whether we can do better with our money. I'm wondering whether there's some way we can keep this conversation going. But I wondered also whether I could ask the people on this panel, from what you've heard tonight, do you hope, do you genuinely think, do you believe that we are going to be able to do it in Scotland? And if so, if you had a magic wand, what would be the one thing you'd ask for?
I think we can do it because I think we have, as I was talking when I was speaking, we have changed in some areas of Scottish life dramatically in recent years, which shows that if we focus on something and if we have the will, we can do it. If there was one thing that I would pick on as the thing that Karyn raised as well, universal basic income.
Yeah.
I think that transforms people's lives.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Karyn, yourself, from, I mean, I know
I'm still raging after that girl's telling me.
Yeah.
You know,
the council.
I mean, I'm still raging.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we should get Arunda Bootia and get out and visit your council, basically, maybe. Alan.
I've really enjoyed tonight. I think my takeaway from it is the same takeaway I had for all the work I did last year on what does Scotland need to do to demonstrate leadership in human rights. It's having ambition. And I get a sense that amongst all those who are out there, there's a sense of ambition to do better and make it a better country. And in these Brexit times, that ambition is precious. It's gold dust. So let's hang on to it.
Thank you so much. Before, I'm going to hand over now to Graham Brown, Director of Shelters Scotland. But my observation is 50 years after Shelters' inception, it's possibly needed now more than ever. Thank you very much to fantastic panellists and great contributions from the floor.